Okay. I have a set list of questions.
Yeah.
But we don't have to stick to those. We can go off tangent if you feel it necessary or interesting to do so.
No, that's fine.
Can we start with basic information? So your name, your date, your place of birth, and a little bit of information about where you're from, your upbringing, that sort of thing.
Okay. Bill Kidd, Dr. William Kidd, 14th of July 1944, a date which has a certain symbolic resonance in some ways. Place of birth, Glasgow. That's Glasgow as in Scotland. I am currently an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Stirling. Previously, I was reader in French and head of the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at Stirling. So I'm now a retired person, but still research active in various fields. Upbringing, Glasgow, standard state primary school, high school, University of Glasgow. What more can I tell you about me?
So for example, were you from a very politicized family, a non-politicized family? Was politics?
No, a politically minded father, a relatively apolitical mother from a kind of conservative working class background, but not politically active in any way. So no background, parental or even in my own side. I'm a political observer rather than an activist. Okay. An accidental activist, maybe.
Aren't many of us. So can you tell me what brought you to France in 1968, please?
Well, I'll try to keep it short. What brought me to France in 1968 was the fact that I had graduated from the University of Glasgow in June 1967. And in fact, I went to France in September 67 to begin doctoral research for a PhD for Glasgow, but also to take classes in troisième cycle at the Institut d'études politiques, Sciences Po, as we know it. So it was a logical kind of progression. Crucially, however, I had spent the whole year 64-65 as lecteur d'anglais in the Lycée Condorcet, Paris. And that was the seminal year from every point of view.
Would you develop why that was so important?
Well, I had just been admitted. The Scottish University program is a 4-year honours, double honours program with a year in each language studied intercalated. And I had done the first 2 years of a program which had only just been introduced: honours in modern French language and literature and modern history. There were 3 of us in that program who were doing it for the very first time. And to be in Paris for 64-65 with that program was just phenomenal, because the whole rehabilitation of Pétain question mark was bubbling away with Jacques Zorny and Tixier-Vignancourt. There was a big controversy about the refusal to grant Végan a state funeral in January 65. The war was still very recent. I mean, the Algerian war was immediate, but the war was still very recent. And in Lycée Condorcet, I was meeting teachers who had been in the resistance or suspected of collaboration. So the thing at a private level was quite discussable. And in a public level, it was kind of in the air of the period. I went along to Saint-Philippe du Roule in January 65 to watch this Végan funeral. And it was extraordinary, just the whole intellectual stimulation. The year was also very important in other ways. I had very little experience of the French educational system. And at Condorcet, I discovered that there were all sorts of pupils who were actually post-baccalaureate doing cours préparatoires aux grandes écoles, so that there was a kind of schoolboy population who were also étudiants. And there were also state school teachers teaching in university as well as school. Now, this was unthinkable in my intellectual school background. For a teacher in Condorcet to say, no, I can't see you tomorrow, j'ai un cours en fac, that was very strange. And the third thing that was interesting about it was, although I was living in the cité universitaire, and therefore had a carte d'étudiant and all that, everybody, the street wisdom was, get a carte d'étudiant for access to restaurants, student restaurants, travel, and so on. And mythically, apparently, Langues Orientales had thousands of phantom students enrolled just to get the carte d'étudiant. Now, I didn't need to do that, but I went to courses briefly at the Sorbonne and was astonished to discover that there were so many students in the course that in the lecture theatre, the students were sitting in the stairs down the corridors. And secondly, that getting hold of a member of teaching staff was next to impossible, either because they were so lofty in their own departments, or because they were hopping on the next train to somewhere, and Paris was a kind of visiting activity. So I got a sense of the disorganization of French university education, however intermittent, which came back and hit me, seriously full pelt when I went to Paris in '67. So I had various options to do my research, but going back to Paris and going to Sciences Po was a no-brainer. So that's how I came to be there.
And what were your living conditions in 1967, 68? Were you in the halls of residence? Were you in a shared?
Sorry, I'm losing a wee bit again, Chris.
What were your living conditions in 67, 68?
My what?
Living conditions were...
Oh, my living conditions were a funny mixture, I beg your pardon. I have my hearing aid up. My living conditions in 67, I had been able to rent a 2-room flat on the 6th floor of a building in the 7th arrondissement. The flat had no inside toilet. It had no heating system. It was basically 2 chambres de bonne run together. But I was getting married in December, so I had been looking for a 2 pièces of some kind. So from one point of view, the living conditions were very good, if up 6 floors without an elevator and extremely basic, unfurnished, were good. They were certainly better than many others, but I had to do additional work alongside my grant for the PhD. Therefore, I had worked with a language school teaching Air France executives, but I also, and this is the key thing, through a friend and contact, I got a temporary job as a chargé de cours in the Annexe Censier at the Sorbonne. So there I was in September 67, October 67, waiting patiently for la rentrée, which didn't take place until 2 months later. So I kind of knew that there was a bit of a powder keg going on.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. To what extent was there a sense that something was coming?
I think people saw it coming, but they didn't foresee the scale or the intensity of the events, nor their extension into the social workerist general strike part of it. I mean, there were a lot of rumblings. There was a lot of turbulence politically between the Gaullist regime and the left. But I don't think anyone quite foresaw how rapidly the thing would escalate. but at a local level, it was very clear that there was serious turbulence. My classes at Sancier, which were overspill classes, were at 8 o'clock at night and 9 o'clock at night, 20 students in each group, 3,000 students in the first division, and 3 secretaries. If you wanted photocopying, you had to give a préavis of about a fortnight. And the head of division actually taught in Bordeaux. So when the students said they couldn't ever get hold of their tutor, well, they could get me. But when they said they couldn't get hold of the next guy up the food chain, think how difficult it was for staff to get. That was simply, and they were very unhappy with the situation, but they accepted it also with a kind of shrug that this was how it was, no selection. In Berfit's suggestion that there should be selection was one of the detonators. Students were very unhappy and they moaned and groaned, but at the same time they shrugged and said, well, that's the way it is. I mean, it's quite intriguing. You end up having a coffee with those students at 10 o'clock at night. And this was routine. So for a UK, someone educated in the UK, and Glasgow had one of the biggest French departments in the UK, the disconnect between staff and students and tutorials and lectures and the hierarchy of personnel was unimaginable.
So there were some signs of discontent within the education system. How about at a more general level in terms of this idea of...
You need to speak up a wee bit, Chris, I'm sorry.
What about, so you've described some of the discontent that may have existed within the education system, but I wonder if there was a more general discontent amongst young people from a, say, cultural, social perspective, you know, changing generations, fashion, clothes, music, that sort of thing?
Well, I think there was a kind of general discontent, a kind of sociological discontent, that they were painfully aware that they wanted to defend universal access to university, but they could see that this universal access was producing mass congestion at a point where the cultural mores were telling them, question authority, don't accept hierarchies, défoule-toi. And the university had not got any kind of answer to this. So I'm sure also in the kind of musical, cultural, artistic scene that they were involved in, and I was at a certain distance from, there were factors that they were conscious of this société de consommation. They were very aware of the fact that the society around them was very driven by material questions, which they professed to be, in a way, over and above. But then, in another neck of the woods, I was at Sciences Po. Now, Troisième Cycle had a fairly international intake. There were 46 or 45 or 46 of us in the first year of Troisième Cycle. And I would say up to a third, perhaps more, were non-French. And they were slightly more socially disparate in background than the first and second cycles, which had a pretty uniformly French, Parisian, middle class clientele. So I was much less aware of the kind of pressures in the system at Sciences Po, partly because being a grande école, it had a much better staff-student ratio, and partly because it was to some extent sheltered from the outside influences, cross-class outside influences. But that's a sweeping statement, Chris, so you need to quantify it or refine it a wee bit. The Troisième Cycle, I think, were more responsive to the issues that were going on possibly because they were a bit older, possibly because in one sense they were in the thing but not of it. You know, I have always found myself to be a bit of an insider-outsider in France. Inside enough because of language competence and outside enough because of background to have that. It can be a privileged position. I've been told a dozen times during my research, oh, they'll speak to you because you're British. You're working on something sensitive at the occupation. They'll talk to you because you're British, but they won't necessarily talk to a French person. So you've got that insight. And people were asked often in Sciences Po, you know, vous qui êtes anglais, which of course I jibbed that, vous qui êtes anglais. What's your take on all of this? So there was quite an interesting conversation going on. And one of my accidental involvements at Sciences Po was, notwithstanding its very right-wing reputation, Occident decided, you know, Occident had a provocateur role. Occident decided that they would come and nettoyer Sciences Po of its left-wing components. And a special mobilization of students was mounted to fight off this threat, which ended up with a whimper and not a bang. But there were staff and students from 3e cycle mobilizing in the Ola at the front of the building in case this nettoyage in the form of Occident appeared. So, you know, and I had echoes all over the place of 64, 65 in this, you know, the development of that kind of right-wing irredentist feel.
I wondered how aware or what influence there was of what's going on internationally at the time.
Yes, one was very aware of the international context, the Vietnam issue, Prague, Kennedy assassination was quite close to all of that. There was also an awareness that universities in different parts of Europe were bubbling, partly for similar reasons, and in kind of globalization. I mean, we talk a lot about globalization now, but there was globalization then in terms of influences and social patterns. So yes, and 3e cycle was probably more aware of that because there were Americans and Europeans and Eurasians and so on. It was quite a cosmopolitan establishment, 3e cycle, and I think splendidly so. It was very, very a hothouse of intellectual exchange. I only did 2 years of the program and left in the summer of '69 because by that time I had some family responsibilities and needed to stop being a student and start earning a salary.
Damn children. Would you describe yourself as having been politically or socially active prior to 1968?
No. I wasn't politically active. I've never been a member of a political party. I had fairly strong but evolving views about the British political. I've been a lifelong supporter of proportional representation, for example. You grow up in Glasgow, where at one point almost 100% of the local councillors were in the Labour Party, and yet a very large proportion of the Glasgow population voted Tory certainly until the late 50s, early 60s. There was this huge disconnect between the two monolithical parties. So ever since I was a student, I have been a PR person in that sense. But I wasn't politically active, and I take a very keen interest in politics. But even in France, I wasn't politically active. I kind of knew which courant I approved of or sympathized with, but I wasn't an activist in that. My involvement in demonstrations and the occasional stone throwing was accidental or contextual. I found myself in a place and it was happening, and suddenly the police were there. I took part in 2 of the big défilés and the Sciences Po business, but I was, I suppose, a sympathetic spectator much of the time. I mean, I remember going round the day after the Nuit des Barricades and looking at the devastation in the Rue Gay-Lussac. It was unbelievable. I mean, I had favourite cafes in that street. You know, a couple of hundred burnt out cars in it, you know. So the whole thing was very, crystallizing, I suppose.
Okay. Can you tell me how you started to experience what your experience was when the events started to kick off? How did you start to become aware that something was happening?
Well, when I knew where Nanterre was, and I had been following, because in Sciences Po it was talk. There was talk about the Mouvement du 22 Mars and what was happening at Nanterre and segregation in the residencies and all that stuff. People were aware of it. But it was the closure of the Sorbonne, because Sancier was closed as well. So when the Rector Roche closed the Sorbonne on the 3rd of May, I think it was, like many others, I was at the door. I was outside and went back the following day to see if it was being reopened, and it wasn't. In fact, I was with a group and we stood outside, and there were CRS across the main entrance to the Sorbonne, and somebody said, you know, that what's going on, is the Sorbonne open or closed? And we were told, c'est-à-dire que la Sorbonne est ouverte, mais vous n'y entrez pas. Now, I hadn't really understood until that point that the students believed that the Quartier Latin was in somehow their Quartier Latin, that the police had no business there, basically. And they certainly had no business interdicting the Sorbonne. So from that point on, I was very, very aware of what was happening. And I was in the Latin Quarter every day, partly to go into Sciences Po, but I always made a point of going further in to see where the action was and see what was going on. I don't know whether that answers the question enough. But
it does. Did you become involved in the events, or you said you were more of an observer? And if you were more of an observer, how did you live day by day? How did you feel the events unfolding?
Well, I was mainly an observer. I mean, at one point, myself and others were caught up in a police charge. So at some point, if you're being chased by the police, you either turn around and you chuck a stone back, or you keep running. And was very close to a number of people who were matraqués. How did I experience it? Extremely frightening. Big adrenaline rush. I mean, just to go into the quartier and see these dozens of police buses and police lined up, and the hammering on the shields with the truncheons and so on, the chanting, the atmosphere was definitely electric. The whole CRS, SS, and you know, the sloganizing, the shouting, but it was also remarkably exciting. The whole attempt to kind of create a movement that was out of something so disparate, by mobilizing on Free the Sorbonne, Free the Camarades, forget which group, or UNEF or MNEF or Étudiants Communistes or Jeunes this or that, forget that and act together as a kind of homogeneous mass. That was extraordinarily exciting, very stimulating. I found that perhaps the most rewarding part of it, because prior to that, there was quite a lot of sectarianism among the different left-wing groups. Maoists, Trotskyists, fundamentalists, etc., which is not it's not the way I'm hardwired, frankly.
And when the general strike kicks in, sort of from the 13th of May onwards, what sort of impact did that have on your daily routine, your day-to-day experience?
Immediately, not much. Gradually, quite significant. because as the strike began to take hold, you started to have a transport paralysis situation, metro not working, bins not being emptied, food shortages, and people were, after it had been running for about 10 days, people were buying food. In our local supermarkets, people were going in and they were buying flour, non-perishables, cans of cassoulet, supermarket trolleys full of stuff. Now, my wife and I, we didn't have a fridge in our little deux pièces high up in the building. And our immediate neighbours were extremely working class people, although it was a bâtiment bourgeois. And our immediate neighbour on one side was an 80-year-old war widow. Husband was killed at Verdun, believe it or not, who had worked in the Renault canteen until retirement. And she had cousins in Brittany who were trying to send her packets of food because they assumed that rationing was immediately about to be introduced. And Madame Sivy said to us, "Mais c'est comme en 40." There were all these booted and helmeted people guarding the ORTF building. By the way, I don't think any student ever went near the ORTF building during the demos. But that was her immediate reflection was, this is like 1940. There's a kind of occupation going on. And when she heard that de Gaulle might be a way off coming back with the Army of the Rhine, she was, you know, completely and utterly amazed at this turn up for the book. She was a wonderful woman. She died before we moved out of the flat, but she was a very interesting indicator because she had a cohort of friends, including the old concierge, who talked about the events and the impact. And of course, being of a certain age, they always look back to the impact of previous things to map onto. We did not suffer unduly, but it became difficult to get foodstuffs. It became difficult to get a packet of golas in the local tabac because they were in short supply. We didn't have a car, so we didn't have a problem with petrol, but queues at petrol stations were phenomenal. And the transport thing was probably the worst because people could not normally go about their business. And my wife taught in a language school on the other side of Paris. So there was a little bit of a problem about getting backwards and forwards to that. I suppose I had some of the ennui of an ordinary Parisian in that respect.
And did you remain supportive of the movement, or did your support wane as the?
Well, I was very supportive of the movement, the general strike movement. Yes, because I thought there are legitimate worker demands in here. You know, this is a wealthy society. It is producing fairly substantial levels of income for the middle class. There is a certain disaffection among the working class. And I thought their demands were pretty legitimate. And the fact, I mean, it was partly political. Pompidou eventually said, we'll sort out the wage demands and separate the workers and the students. That fusion never really took place in any meaningful sense anyway. But no, I was on side to that extent, yeah.
I was going to ask about the coming together of students and workers. Did you have any experience of that? Was it unsuccessful?
None at all. I saw newsreel about the attempts by the students to speak to workers at Renault. I saw a lot of attempts to create common activities, but I didn't participate directly in any of that. I think on the one hand, I thought this was a bit beyond my remit, and it seemed to me to be a more peculiarly French notion. The general strike, all I knew about our general strike was basically what the average well-educated student. I didn't know too much about the French tradition of the grève générale going back to Sorel and company. So in that sense, I was still the outsider, yeah. But we stayed on after the events. We were still in Paris until right the way through until September. So I was kind of interested to watch the gradual tapering off, the grandes vacances syndrome coming in, and the residual elements of activity were quite interesting. When I was also teaching at Air France, my classes at Saucier having been rudely interrupted, if I can put it that way. And it was very interesting because I was teaching cadre as well as personnel navigant. The great Gaullist secret, of course, was that the language of aviation was all English, and therefore they were teaching huge amounts of English to Air France crew, but not wanting to draw too much attention to it. And it was interesting to get opinions. I was asked frequently by different levels of people at Air France, what do you think about this, this, and this? And on the whole, the reactions to the events were fairly predictable. A number of people just said, c'est des filles de bourgeois. You know, and one or two of the non-cadre employees would say, well, you know, students seem to have far too much time on their hands in France to get up to all this. And yet there was a kind of tolerance, you know, que voulez-vous, that's what students do. I mean, as I say, the open secret when I was in France in 64, 65 was everyone said, go to Languedoc, enroll at Langues Orientales, and you'll get your student card. And I said, but I don't know any language, I don't have any qualification for Langues Orientales. That's the point. There must have been thousands of phantom students in Paris in the 60s doing Langues Orientales in order to have a student card. There was a kind of tolerance for what students did. At the same time, once it got seriously violent, there was a bit of a sense that, you know, the students have too much time in their hands, and not a particularly large amount of sympathy to some of the complaints. You know, Nanterre is far too big and it's far too busy and there are too many students and they're not getting a fair deal. Well, I was told, well, ça a toujours été. There have always been too many students in French universities, and
yeah,
that's probably a bit bullying, but
it's fine. One of the characteristics that's often used to describe this period is this idea of une prise de parole, and this sort of ongoing talk shop. Is that something you experienced, and how would you summarize that experience?
Well, I went along to 2 or 3 sessions at the Odeon, which had a kind of 24-hour menu. And it was a mixed bag. There was some very good interventions, some very good ideas being floated. It was a kind of brainstorming thing. And then sometimes it just degenerated into the kind of standard, you know, guilty as charged, the cliches, without an awful lot of connection with reality. But it was interesting that people were saying, well, we've never been asked our opinion about this before. We've always been told this is how it works. Young lecturers would say, you know, the whole promotion system in France depends so much on the kind of clientelism of the senior professors, and there's no transparency, which is not a word that people used then, but that's what we would say now. How come so-and-so got that poste de maître assistant and somebody else with more ancienneté didn't? These things were talked about. I mean, the students were sensitive to the idea that the lecturers and the junior staff were on their side because they had similar grievances. I was struck above all, to me it's almost the most creative part of this prise de parole, by the unofficial newspapers. At one point I had a complete collection of Action and L'Enragé, and I thought they were terrific. Some of the stuff in those, in informal journalism by the activists who produced Action in particular, but also L'Enragé, was superb. And they were being turned down at that Beaux-Arts, as I recall. I think École des Beaux-Arts was occupied by the students, and some of them were produced down there. And that was fascinating to go in. I've not been to art school formally, but to go into a place like Beaux-Arts and see stuff being prepared and cartoons. I mean, there's a whole kind of, what's the word I'm after? A kind of, not Charlie Hebdo, but there's a kind of tradition of French subversive cartoons and newspapers. And I think Action and L'Enragé tapped into that. Yes, I found that the most stimulating, creative bit of the whole thing, the prise de parole, and also the verbalizing and the representation of it.
Okay, sort of a satirical take on it. I wondered if you could give me your response to the question, to what extent do you think May 68 was a violent moment?
To what extent?
Do you think 68 was violent?
Well, it was obviously pretty violent, given the devastation in parts of Paris, the fact that there were 2 or 3 known deaths. The police behaviour was pretty brutal. I mean, there were no prisoners taken. Now, where the fighting was very intense, they were taking casualties too. But it was, by the kind of standards I knew about, pretty violent. And historically, I'm afraid, in a certain tradition of behaviour by the force de l'ordre. There definitely was some quite serious violence meted out by groups on the fringes of the student movement who wanted to make their own case, whether it was Occident, who were not above fisticuffs of various kinds, or the famous Katangais, although I stress, if I wouldn't necessarily have recognized a Katangais in its non-racial sense if I had met one in the street. So I don't think they were an urban myth, but I think their influence may have been a bit exaggerated. But yes, these were violent events. And at one point, my wife and I were running hell for leather away from a police charge. And the tear gassing is by nature indiscriminate. And we had 2 or 3 serious encounters with tear gas, whose effects linger, by the way.
Yeah. I wondered if you were aware at the time that this was a set of events that was taking place beyond Paris and in the regions as well.
Gradually, yes. And I have friends in other parts of France, and we were aware that things were happening elsewhere and that the movement was increasing. But we stayed in Paris throughout the summer, so we didn't actually go out into the provinces. But we were definitely getting information from people, and we could, there was a certain amount of information getting out on television and newspapers, although usually, well, the allegation was the television stuff was pretty seriously censored or adjusted by the regime, and there must have been some truth in it. But the non-official channels, radio channels in particular, were quite good at giving coverage. But I was aware of it, but I wasn't taking a particular interest in what was going on elsewhere. And in fact, come September, my wife and I went to Spain for a holiday. Partly because we needed a break, but also because at that point we reached a certain level of saturation, and need to go and do something different, like lie on a beach, not sous les pavés, kind of beach, a sandy beach.
Yeah. Do you think that as an international student, you were treated differently or had a different experience than your average French person?
I don't know. Remember, Cohn-Bendit was an international student, and that was one of the alarming aspects, the whole business about the Juif Allemand. I could not believe that this kind of thing resurfaced. I don't think international students were treated any differently, but it would, I suppose, depend on their degree of involvement. If the international students had been in the absolute front line, as some of them undoubtedly were, if they had been interpelled or arrested, and there were 600 arrests, I think, after the first Friday or the second, I think they would have had the collars seriously felt. One tiny anecdote, in the following October, so after our return from Spain, my wife and I were walking back along the Rue de Grenelle towards home, and we found 5 10-franc notes lying on the pavement. 50 francs was serious money in those days. And being terribly British, our first instinct was to hand it into a police station. And then there is a commissariat along the Rue de Grenelle because the Soviet embassy is in the Rue de Grenelle. So we went into the police station, explained, monsieur, handed it in, bougez pas. He goes to a file. But this time I've given him my permis de séjour. And then he says, c'est OK, rien contre. Your name's not on the police database. Vous pouvez partir. Only in France could you take money to hand into a police station and be regarded as a figure of suspicion, but perhaps that's too big a statement.
Wow.
But he knew perfectly. I had, British ID. He knew I was an étudiant étranger, but his instinct was to be suspicious. So were international students treated differently? I don't really know, but my own experience suggests that they wouldn't have been had they been in serious trouble.
Yeah. What did you think of the way the crisis was managed by the political elite at the time?
That's a good question. Well, I was very struck by the jockeying for position that was going on, that they weren't sure in a way how to react. Would de Gaulle and Pompidou maintain their separate foreign trip commitments? Yes, they did. You can correct me in this. Did they leave the government in the hands of Louis Jacques, who was the garde des Sceaux? I don't remember, but I don't think it was handled well, in the sense that the government didn't seem to know quite what to do. The fact that there was a certain amount of rivalry in the government, and also that Mitterrand and Mendès France, and each in their own way, wanted to make a response that staked out their own claims in a political sense, possibly didn't help. I thought shutting Nanterre and shutting the Sorbonne was ridiculous, absolutely crazy. It would have been, in my view, simple to deal with the business of the 7 or 8 people from Nanterre who'd been arrested without closing either institution completely. I wasn't in Nanterre, so I don't know how serious the problem was. But I think that wiser counsels might have prevailed. So I don't think it was handled particularly well. The escalation was extraordinary. And I think if you send in riot squads with a very heavy hand, you probably will provoke a reaction. So if it had been more softly, and a little bit better managed by the senior members of academia, I think they were completely dépassés par les événements. I don't think they knew what was happening. And that goes back to the business of the lack of information going up and down. The hierarchy was really only ever dealing with the information it wanted to receive. There wasn't a good information loop inside French university about discontent à la base. If they did know about it, they disregarded it.
Yeah. And what did you think of de Gaulle's performance?
Well, I saw both his televised speeches in a pub, a cafe, and the first one was lamentable. I mean, it was just awful, and I think people realised then, no, that he's yesterday's man almost. It certainly was a much more polished performance the second time, no doubt about that, and the pro-Gaullist march up the Champs-Élysées was pretty amazing. That is an abiding kind of memory, but that is not a direct memory. I've seen that on TV since I wasn't there. I've frequently been on the Champs-Élysées on the 14th of July for reasons not unconnected with my birthday, but I wasn't there when they had that demo. But pictures of Malraux, kind of, en jeune militant, were. I thought de Gaulle's performance was poor, but I think again he was out of his depth, and that silly phrase about la chi en lit came back to haunt him. They weren't adept. They didn't. Don't think they did enough younger, more savvy government ministers who might have kind of read the events a wee bit better. But certainly things were happening fast.
Yeah. So what was your feeling when things came to a conclusion in June? Were you disappointed, relieved?
Well, there was some very bad violence in June. I think there was a final big explosion of stuff around about mid-June, and there were a couple of fatalities. So from one point of view, it was an anticlimax. The thing kind of died a natural death. From one point of view, I was quite relieved because I could not see how much further it could go without serious confrontation. The threat that the military might have to intervene, but it wouldn't be the ordinary squaddies, it would be the French Army of the Rhine who would be more reliable. I think if it had ever come to that, it would have been very serious. So from most points of view, I was fairly relieved that it tailed off. I have to say, regarding something in your questionnaire outline, we had very little serious anxiety from our families, from our respective families, other than the kind that you might have expected. By the time my wife had become pregnant, senior lady relatives were a little bit worried that Eileen shouldn't be over there with all that going on. But they weren't seriously perturbed. I mean, they knew that this wasn't a war situation or anything like that. That was just a little bit scary.
How did you perceive the impact on France at the time? And is this something that has changed as the years have passed?
I think possibly I'm not specialist or expert enough to answer that. The reform of the universities Edgar Faure and what have you, I thought was long overdue. I'm not sure that the reform was too clever. I mean, at one point there was a whole issue of what to do with the library. You know, once the Sorbonne was devolved into different universities, what would they do with the library, and could they have a Cartesian solution to that? And it was pretty dogmatic what they did rather than pragmatic. I think it did give enough of a shock to the kind of political cast that this level of turbulence from the grassroots could generate so much trouble. But their relief at preventing the thing becoming a social workerist revolution was probably their main concern. And that was the thing that seriously scared the establishment. And the workers did get benefits from it. And I think probably the lasting sense was that the regime cannot really afford to get so out of touch as it appeared to be. Now, more specialist people than I am could tell you whether that's proved a lasting acquis. Probably also the kind of loss of credibility by a certain intellectual elite whom the students very conspicuously turned their backs on, Sartre, Aragon and company, while buying into Herbert Marcuse. And I had to read Herbert Marcuse as part of one of my submissions at Sciences Po. So the stuff was real and around. I think that slight change in the respect to a certain intellectual class, but then the French intellectual class is regenerating all the time. There's always a French intellectual class, public intellectual class. And of course, the whole question about women and women's space and place and all of this. Again, I'm not in any sense a specialist in feminist legacies of May 68, but that must have been pretty important. Speaking to French friends, since it's 50 years ago, as you know, speaking to French friends over that period, yes, when they look back, they're mostly positive about it, but in a relatively low-key way. I don't think any of them thought that's where France took a terribly wrong turn. I mean, apart from the fundamentalist right-wing, diehards, I don't think anybody in my peer group or group of friends thought that, this was a complete and utter sans issue that they were involved in, that it had good impacts, good effects.
Yeah.
Which is broadly what I think.
Do you think that these events had an impact on your understanding of France?
I think it did because, well, first of all, because of the Sciences Po connection, in 67, 68, the big project starting for the Séminaire Général became a big conference on Vichy, Vichy revisited. And what was clear was that May 68 had been part of that pulling down of certain received narratives, which had opened up a revisiting. Now, of course, there were other things as well. There were, the Marison Paxton and so on, non-French historians looking at that. But that definitely gave a decisive kick towards revisiting the whole thing about the Les Années Noires. And people in Troisième Cycle, by the way, who were pretty well-established right-wingers who had a certain view of collaboration and collaborationist activities that I found extraordinary, but nonetheless it was, that was the way they were, that was the attitude they had. And so from that point of view, I felt that May 68 had contributed to that prise de conscience about the way there have been various forms of government and collective amnesia erected, screens were pulled down, and issues were reopened. And much of my academic work was about rediscovering aspects of World War II. And so I saw a certain continuity there. The other thing that I found quite fascinating in the 70s, on the kind of immediate legacy period, was the number of books about May 68, including Merle derrière la vitre about Nanterre, which seemed to me to be so bang on in terms of its sociology of French university life. And I subsequently did a couple of conference things on May 68 and did a couple of articles or chapters in books about looking back at the representation of May 68 in French fiction. So it had an impact on my activities. Yeah, I gave numerous talks in British or Scottish universities anyway about May 68, which were always kind of quite well received because people had known about, what was going on, but they hadn't actually seen and been. The first time I saw mountains of dust bins and bags of rubbish in the street wasn't in the UK in the winter of discontent. It was in Paris in the summer of 1968. I've since seen it in Toulouse, by the way. Several years ago, we were down in Toulouse for a conference, and there was a utility strike. And the bags of rubbish were 6 feet high in some of the streets of Toulouse. It's socially quite illuminating when something like that happens. Things are bad.
So you've spelled out how 68 had an impact on your scholarship. How would you summarize how 68 had an impact on you personally or politically?
Politically, it confirmed my my hard wiring, I think. I've never been very interested in the kind of fissile nature of left-wing groups and their kind of mutual excommunications and hostilities. It definitely made me think always that there had to be a much more democratic level of representational structure in politics. So I've always been A, PR, B, federalist in that sense. Beyond that, probably not a lot. The big issues politically for me have been the unrepresentative nature of British democracy. Saying British democracy, well, you don't need a credo.
Just a couple more questions. You mentioned briefly earlier that you were interested in representations of these events, particularly in the 1970s. Are you aware of the current dominant narrative on 1968? And if so, how accurately do you think it captures the essence of the time?
No, I'm not aware of the current dominant narrative at all. I have not read. I mean, I was rereading one or two things with this upcoming interview in mind, and also with cleaning my study, which is badly overdue for books off the floor and back onto shelves. But I'm not aware of the dominant narrative. I guess I run out in bibliographical terms about a decade ago. So what is the current dominant narrative?
Well, it depends on who you speak to. In my work, I've tried to argue that there is a very limited, narrow perspective that has in some ways diluted the true magnitude of the events, and an overemphasis perhaps on Paris, on students, and on May '68, and yeah, in my work, I've sought to try and challenge that dominant narrative and widen the geographical, temporal, and participant framework.
Yeah, well, I mean, that sounds to me entirely opposite. There was stuff going on elsewhere in France, a lot of stuff going on elsewhere in France, but France was, and to some extent still is, but was very Paris-centered. And certainly there wasn't just me, because the effects of the thing lasted through the summer, and well beyond. So that, you know, I mean, a priori, I wouldn't quarrel with that at all. My own perspective is quite Paris-focused, but quite long, because it's almost inseparable from my year 64, 65, which kind of sensitized me to a lot of, yeah, it just made me aware of the kind of background noise that's going on in any society at any given time. I mean, I wasn't a stranger to France, but I'd not lived there almost continuously for the whole of that year. And then I was there almost continuously from beginning of September 67 to late August 69, and umpteen times since, of course. But
yeah, I mean, I would argue that in order to understand 68 in its entirety, one needs to widen the time frame right back to the mid-1960s and then into maybe the mid-1970s, because it's not just a month or a number of weeks. It's
yeah,
and that's that. There's a term they use in French called it's les années 68. Captures that it's much more than just 1 month. It's a much longer.
Yeah, continuum, absolutely. Especially if you hook it into the whole barricade tradition and pulling up paving stones in Paris, and you go right back to the Commune, I suppose, or the Revolution. Yes.
Okay, well, one last question, Bill, probably the hardest one. If you had 30 seconds to summarize your experience of 68, how would you do it?
Very exciting, very stimulating, very revealing. Big crystallizing impact on ideas that were probably a little bit untidy and disorganized. Enjoyable, quite a privilege to have been there, I suppose. Not traumatic personally in any way, which was good.